Hello, this video is on chapter 21. This is mostly going to be about the 1920s with a few years in 1919 and in the 1930s. Our essential question for this chapter is, what conflicts in culture and politics arose in the 1920s, and how did economic developments in that decade help cause the Great Depression? So just a quick understanding of some of the changes that happened due to World War I. Before World War I, we saw an age of progressive reforms where people tried to make changes to the government and business. However, after World War I, there is still some progressive movement, but nationally it does not have that much power. People are kind of sick of trying to change everything. Instead of trying to reform businesses and make rules for them, American businesses were becoming the top priority, and the desire was to let them do whatever they wanted. Before World War I, America was increasing towards imperialism. But after World War I, we decided to kind of withdraw from the rest of the world and try to not be a part of it and be dragged into other conflicts. So kind of an example of how America became fearful of the rest of the world is this fear over communism spreading from other countries to the United States. And this kind of comes about in a couple of ways. One, we've seen communist influence in other countries, but also during World War I, the labor unions grew pretty dramatically during the war. They were getting higher pay, better working conditions. Even despite this increase, many workers still went on strike in 1919, wanting even better pay and more hours. And so some Americans are afraid that these strikers and unionists want a revolution and completely change our economic structures into a communist system. And so this leads to a Red Scare, the fear of communist influence. Sometimes you might see in the textbook or a document them refer to this as Bolshevism. It's the same thing. Now, even though there's this fear that communists might take over the United States, in reality, the Communist Party only had about 13,000 registered members. So not nearly enough to actually have an impact on the American political system. Here you can see some union members going on strike, trying to get more pay, better working conditions. And the Red Scare would culminate in 1919 with a terrorist attack. You see 34 bombs were sent in the mail addressed to different government officials, including the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer. An Attorney General is a position that is pretty much the top law enforcement officer of the national government. A bomb exploded right outside of his home, and he took it very personally. And he, along with others, accused the Unionists and revolutionaries of being behind these bombs. Now, we don't actually know where the bombs came from, but that's who was accused of doing it. And so he directed the Department of Justice to raid any radical organizations that focused on communism or anarchy, many union groups. They raided these groups. Thousands of people were arrested. Thousands of people who were arrested were actually deported, even if they were legal immigrants in the United States. And many of the people who were arrested and raided by the radical organizations had not broken any laws and had no connection to these bombings, but the bombings were used as justification for it. And along with this Red Scare, the fear of communism, it coupled with a fear of radicalism, that people would radically want to change our government, and a fear of immigrants. And so one famous example of this is the court case of the century, because that's what it was described as, of Sacco and Vanzetti, two immigrants who were arrested for murder. They were both Italian immigrants, and they happened to be anarchists. And in the courtroom itself, there was some sketchy evidence that was being debated. But then the prosecutor really tied these two men to the radical groups, and basically trying to portray these two men as radicals and anarchists, which has nothing to do with the case, but they knew it would get the jury to be against them, and they were found guilty and executed. Another major change that happens right after World War I are issues concerning race. You see, during World War I, African Americans are both bravely fighting on the front lines of the war, but also essential to the workforce back in the United States on the home front in industries. Thousands of African Americans would move from southern plantations to northern and midwestern cities to get jobs in wartime factories. However, this often led to competition for white working class people over jobs, over housing. And many of this happened in cities where there hadn't been a high African American population in the past. And so this competition and conflict is new. And when that confrontation happened, sometimes it turned violent. It also came about when, after the war, African Americans who had fought in the war had come back and fought bravely. Their friends fought alongside them, many of which died. They gave up so much time to their country. They'd given up their safety for their country. And they come back and they realize that they are still being treated as second-class citizens, even though they loyally served their country. And so all these different factors lead to a series of riots and mob attacks throughout the summer of 1919, known as Red Summer. A riot in Chicago lasted for 5 days. There are 78 known lynchings, and there's probably more in 1919 alone, of African American men. And one of the most famous examples of the racial tension of the time was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Tulsa, Oklahoma was home to what was called Black Wall Street, which is a neighborhood in the city where some of the most wealthy African Americans in the whole country lived. A conflict led to white mobs coming into the neighborhoods, killing at least 30 people. Some estimates think it could be high as a couple hundred. People were killed, homes were destroyed, businesses burned down to the ground. And that's called the Tulsa Massacre. So again, we see in the 1920s is also a decade where African Americans had not been protected by the national or state governments. Here you can see some pictures. One from Chicago, where we have the man on the left who is a returning veteran and demanding more equal rights, and the man on the right who was part of the National Guard out to stop the fighting, stop the mobs. Here you can see buildings burning during the Tulsa race riot or Tulsa massacre. Now, for businesses, they're going to be growing after World War I. Businesses and governors and politicians would fight against labor unions to get more power. Many businesses refused to negotiate with labor unions at all. And in the 1920s, labor union membership would actually decline. Now, with businesses growing, Americans' ties to businesses around the country, around the world, also is changing. While America is still very isolationist, as far as businesses are growing around the world. One example of this is having business owners in the United States giving loans to foreign countries so they could buy American products. So making deals with them, hey, we'll give you money if you buy some of our stuff. And in some cases, if a country did not repay their loan, they would use American military to make sure they paid their debts. And this is called dollar diplomacy. Now, in 1920, this man, Warren G. Harding, was fighting for a return to normalcy as far as the government staying out of the way of businesses, stop regulating and making rules for businesses. And after a lot of years of progressive changes, many Americans are kind of done with changing and want things to go back to the way they were. And so he wins the presidency in 1920, ushering in a decade where businesses can pretty much do whatever they want. However, towards the end of his term, Warren G. Harding actually died of a heart attack. And so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, would be sworn into the presidency. And it just turns out that after Harding died, all this info came out that a lot of people in his presidency were very corrupt and had unhealthy ties to businesses, like in the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome is I believe it's a national forest out west. And it turned out that government officials in Harding's presidency were secretly giving land out to oil companies and taking this land that's supposed to be protected and giving them basically free reign to take as much oil as they want, and destroyed a lot of protected forests. It turns out people were taking bribes, people were corrupt. Here you can see the Teapot Dome oil scandal. Now, President Coolidge comes into office and he agrees with Harding, who is now dead, but he agrees with him that they should do whatever they can to help businesses grow. They should have tax cuts for businesses, so businesses don't have to pay as much in taxes. And so businesses are going to grow under Coolidge's presidency. With new innovations like the assembly line, mechanization, electrification, businesses are growing, productivity is growing, middle class workers' incomes are rising. But some industries and factories are having trouble. For example, agriculture. They don't need to grow as much food anymore. And so with a low supply, that leads to a low demand. I'm sorry, high supply. They made too much food. High supply led to low demand. And that led to low prices. Lots of farmers lost their homes, lost their farms. Coal, textile, railroad all faced problems. Here you can see in this graph, during World War I, the price of textiles, clothing is very high, and it dropped almost 50% and stayed that way pretty much the whole decade. Okay, here you can see the price of farm products. So all the farmers, what price are they selling for? It goes way down after World War I. It stays pretty low throughout the whole decade. So I'm going to go through this slide really fast. Basically, people are middle-class Americans have more money than they have before. And so begin spending money on going to movies, even movies with sound or talkies. Women begin to become more independent. One of the most famous example of this are Flappers, which was a woman who was young, more independent, into dancing, smoking, more sexual freedom. Here you can see a picture of some Flappers. But there was a pushback with this as well, of with a lot of changes going on, and how are people who don't want that change fighting against that. Here's an example of women who are going swimming, and there's a local ordinance that the swimsuit had to be so long, and so this man has a tape measure out and is measuring how far away the swimsuit is from her knee, and to see if that swimsuit is in violation. I'll go through this one quickly too. More people are buying cars than ever before. So yeah, that's basically that slide, more cars. Now, in a previous chapter, we had already talked about how women had gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. And with more women now in the electorate and able to vote in politics, politicians begin to become a little bit more reflective of what women want, like passing the Shepard-Towner Act that would try to pay for medical clinics to lower infant mortality rates. Women continued to organize to fight for women's rights and women's opportunities. However, these groups are also very segregated. And so some women's rights groups were for white women only and would not fight for racial injustice or fight against racial injustice. So we talked about women are changing, becoming more independent, have more political say. However, despite this, women are still paid less than men and still are denied many opportunities in certain occupations. Now, one major change we see in the 1920s is that for the first time, more people are living in cities than in the country. This is a major change. And one that we still kind of see today is a very big difference between people living in cities and in rural towns. So an example of this is the 18th Amendment that was passed to outlaw creating and selling alcohol. Okay, this is prohibition. This was widely supported by small towns and rural farmers and despised by urban immigrants and citizens living in these big cities. So big cities developed speakeasies, which are underground bars where alcohol was illegally sold. You had to know like a password to get in. It also led to gangsters like Al Capone, who would create territory and would fight against other gangsters and increase violence in major cities over who gets to sell alcohol where. And prohibition was not really well enforced, wasn't funded well, and it would be around for about 10 years. Here you can see on the left, people voting, wanting to get rid of alcohol, and others on the right, obviously wanting alcohol. Okay, here you can see people, this is a fake truck. Well, the truck is real, but the back is fake. This is how they would bring alcohol into the city. They stored in this truck, and then no one would know that actually alcohol is being transported. Okay, these people are not following the law. And if police saw that there was alcohol, they would pour it down the drain. These people had been pouring it down the street, and you can see in another situation on the right, these kids got buckets and cups and are going to the gutter and trying to get any alcohol they can before it goes down the drain. Another major difference between the cities and country is what to do with Christianity, specifically Christianity in schools. In rural areas, fundamentalism tried to keep school curriculum based on biblical interpretations. The most famous example of this is creationism. Many schools had still taught that that the earth was created by the Christian God in 6 days, and that Darwin's theory of evolution was not allowed to be taught. And so one example of this culture war is in Tennessee, when this teacher, John T. Scopes, broke the law. He taught theory of evolution, and it became a national sensation. And this trial that he went to basically forced Americans to decide if they would side with Christian fundamentalism or new scientific research. I talked before about how there was this fear of immigrants that continues throughout the 1920s. And politicians eventually act on that fear by creating the National Origins Act in 1924. And it said that any immigration from a country cannot exceed 2% of that nationality's percentage of the population from back in 1890. What does that mean? So that means if, let's say, there were 100 people who were from Italy in 1890 in the United States, only 2 could come to the United States that year. But if there's 100,000 Englishmen in the United States, that means that 2,000 English immigrants could come into the United States. So they intentionally picked the year 1890 because that's a year when there was a very small population of people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that way, not very many people from those countries could immigrate into the United States. Even though there was definitely a target for Southern and Eastern Europeans coming into the United States, there actually was unlimited immigration from North and South America, And we see between 1900 and 1930, over 1 million Mexican immigrants coming into the United States. Another major issue we see in the 1920s is with the increase of the Ku Klux Klan. We had talked about them before with the end of Reconstruction. They had actually gone dormant and fell away for quite a while. When in the 1920s, with this growth of anti-immigrant and anti-radicalism, the Ku Klux Klan increases, draws more members, and begin to hate more people, not just African Americans, but also immigrants, Catholics, and Jews, and eventually rise to over 3 million members. And in 1928, we have a new president, this man, Herbert Hoover. He was famous in World War I because he ran the Food Administration. And if you remember from the previous chapter, the Food Administration, what they did is they asked people to voluntarily give up meat and sweets and give up food for the war effort and to help fight inflation. He's all about people voluntarily doing something to help society, not the government forcing people to do it. Here's a picture of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the 1920s. I think I might have shown this before, but just in case I haven't, when I show this picture, I usually ask, where do you think this picture is from? And many students will say, is it Arkansas or South Carolina or Texas? Actually, this picture was taken in Madison, Wisconsin. It was actually for I believe, a funeral for another man. This is another picture taken in 1925. For African Americans, the 1920s was a time period, that started off incredibly difficult with the Chicago riots and the Tulsa massacre, and was a very difficult decade as far as the government acting to protect people's civil rights. And so a major change that would actually affect many African Americans at the time was this new movement in the African American community that really started and sparked in Harlem, New York, where Black artists, writers, intellectuals, musicians began to outwardly question society and kind of demand recognition for African Americans' roles in society and how they impacted and helped the country grow. Writers gave this term the Harlem Renaissance. It kind of argued that African Americans are growing and changing, and but that they've also helped this country grow and change. And so we see things like jazz music spread across the country. People like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong changing the music in the United States. And there began a new movement to kind of question what should African Americans do in the United States as far as their role in society, what they should do to gain more rights. We had seen discussions and arguments about this before between people like Webb Du Bois, Washington. Another famous man we need to know was Marcus Garvey, and he started a group called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he tried to argue that that African American workers should fight together. And he also argued for Black nationalism, which is basically the idea of in one part, African Americans should move back to Africa to be in charge of themselves there, with the belief that by living in America, they would never have complete autonomy over themselves. And in the final part of this chapter, we're looking at the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, I had mentioned how there are some economic problems going on. The decade is really strange because in some cases, middle-class workers are doing pretty well. In other cases, the working class are falling into debt. People working in factories are falling into debt. Farmers are buying more land and going into debt. Many Americans, and even in the middle class, begin to borrow money to buy in the stock market, which is fine as long as the stock market goes up and you can pay your money back. But if you borrow money and the stock market goes down, it's going to be difficult to pay that money back. Well, in 1929, by this time, stocks had been increasing for the last decade. Stockbrokers realized that what they owned was not really worth what they were selling it for. People began to sell. It created a crash. Millions of dollars that were invested are simply gone, vanish. Factories fall. Businesses go bankrupt. Businesses have to fire workers, lay off people. Unemployment goes up to 24%. And when people lose money in the stock market, they lose their jobs and they lose their wages. They can't spend any money. And consumer spending is one of the largest ways that helps our economy grow. And if we can't grow because our consumers or people aren't spending money, our economy would slip into a recession and in here, a depression. Americans can't pay back their loans, and the loans they had out with banks, they go to business because they're not getting money back from people. Now, some thought that private charities would help them. Churches and synagogues, they began to help people, giving away supplies and food to people who needed it. But this is something that wasn't going to be done in a week or two or a month or two. This is something that's going to last years. And it's going to be needing bigger change. Local governments, state governments aren't really doing much to fix things. And I like this picture. This is taken in New York City, right outside the New York Stock Exchange, where stocks are bought and sold. And we have these hundreds of people waiting for news that their life savings hasn't been destroyed, waiting to hear that perhaps there's something left. And for most of them, they weren't getting good news that day. I like showing this picture because I'm going to show you another picture that takes place at this very same spot in a couple chapters. And that's about 15 years later. And America is going to be dramatically different from when this picture is taken and when the next picture is taken. That is it for this chapter. In the next chapter, we'll talk about some of the effects of the Great Depression and what the government decided to do to stop it. If you have any questions, please let your teacher know. Thank you.